That specific exhaustion after a long social event, even one you genuinely enjoyed. Or the opposite. The restlessness, the low hum of anxiety that comes from too many hours alone. You've watched someone make a decision that seemed obvious to you and felt something close to disbelief, not because they were stupid, because they were using completely different criteria than you would have used. As if the same situation produced two entirely different realities. You've probably blamed personality differences, upbringing, values. Sometimes you blamed yourself for being too much, too sensitive, too rigid, too detached. But Carl Jung had a different diagnosis, and it's harder to dismiss. Jung spent nearly 20 years, not theorizing in isolation, but observing patients, colleagues, artists, philosophers. And he arrived at something most people find uncomfortable. Humans are not just different in degree, they are different in type. Psychologically distinct in the way they perceive the world, process information, make decisions, and generate and spend energy. Not randomly, not arbitrarily, but according to a deep structure that forms early and persists. This is not the psychology of your horoscope. Jung himself was careful to say that types are not rigid boxes. They are patterns, tendencies so consistent, so structural, that once you see them, you cannot unsee them. In Psychological Types, he wrote that these differences create genuine incomprehension between people. Not miscommunication, incomprehension. Two minds looking at the same event and arriving at conclusions so different that each suspects the other of either stupidity or dishonesty. That conflict you keep having with the same person. The career that drains you even though it looks correct on paper. The decisions you keep making that feel right in the moment and hollow in the aftermath. These aren't failures of willpower or character. They may be what happens when a person spends years operating against their own psychological architecture, forcing processes that don't belong to them, suppressing the ones that do. What Jung offers is a map, not a flattering one. Not a map that tells you you're special and misunderstood, and just need to find your people. A map that shows you where you actually are, and more uncomfortably, why you keep ending up there. By the end of this video, you'll be able to name your type, not as a label, but as a structure. You'll understand why certain tasks energize you and others hollow you out, why certain people exhaust you without meaning to, why you keep excelling in some areas and blindly, repeatedly failing in others. And you'll understand that this knowledge is not comfort, it is responsibility. Because once you know how your mind is built, you lose the excuse of not knowing. Forget everything you think you know about introversion and extroversion. The popular version, shy versus outgoing, quiet versus loud, loner versus social butterfly, is not just incomplete. It's a distortion that has caused millions of people to misunderstand their own psychology for decades. Jung's distinction cuts deeper than behavior. It points to something structural, the direction of your psychic energy, where it naturally flows, where it originates. For Jung, introversion and extroversion are not personality traits you perform. They are attitudes, fundamental orientations of the psyche that determine how you relate to the world before you even make a conscious choice. The extrovert's energy moves outward, toward objects, people, events, stimulation. The external world is not just interesting to the extrovert, it is energizing. It is where thinking happens, where processing happens, where the extrovert feels most alive. Isolation doesn't just bore the extrovert, it depletes them. It cuts them off from the source. You've seen this. The person who thinks out loud, who needs to talk through a problem to understand it, who returns from a crowded event more energized than when they arrived. That's not performance. That's the energy moving in its natural direction. The introvert's energy moves inward, toward reflection, internal imagery, subjective meaning. The introvert doesn't avoid people out of fear or social failure. They retreat because the interior world is where cognition actually happens for them. Excessive external stimulation doesn't just tire the introvert, it interferes. It crowds out the internal space where ideas become clear. Jung noted that the introvert often appears passive or hesitant to the extrovert, not because they lack engagement, but because their engagement is happening somewhere the extrovert can't see. Here is the critical part. Neither attitude is superior. Jung was explicit about this in a way that most people who invoke his name forget. Each attitude has its own logic, its own blind spots, its own form of pathology when pushed to the extreme. The extrovert who never turns inward loses contact with their own interior life and becomes hostage to circumstance. The introvert who never moves outward becomes increasingly isolated, increasingly disconnected from reality, increasingly tyrannized by their own subjective world. What creates the damage is not being introverted or extroverted. What creates the damage is living against your natural attitude without knowing it. The introvert who has spent 20 years performing extroversion, in careers that demand constant social output, in relationships that require perpetual availability, in cultures that reward visibility and punish stillness, doesn't just feel tired. They feel like something is wrong with them, like they are fundamentally deficient, like everyone else has access to an energy source they were never given. They weren't deficient. They were running the wrong engine. Jung observed this in clinical practice. People who came in exhausted, anxious, chronically underperforming, often weren't failing because of trauma or pathology. They were failing because they had spent years in systematic conflict with their own psychological structure. Not because anyone forced them, because they didn't know their structure existed. Knowing whether you are introverted or extroverted is the beginning of the map, but it is only half of it. The other half is more precise and more revealing, because within each attitude, there are 4 entirely different ways the mind can be organized, and that is where your type lives. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Every mind does 2 things constantly. It takes in information, and it makes judgments about that information. What Jung discovered, through decades of clinical observation, not theoretical speculation, is that people don't just differ in how much they do these things. They differ in which mental process they trust, which one feels natural, automatic, reliable, and which ones feel foreign, effortful, unreliable. He called these the 4 functions, and they divide cleanly into 2 pairs. The first pair are the perception functions, the 2 ways a mind can absorb reality: sensation and intuition. Sensation focuses on what is concretely present: facts, details, the tangible, verifiable, immediate. The person dominant in sensation trusts their senses above all else. They want evidence they can touch. They distrust abstractions that can't be grounded in observable reality. They are practical, literal, precise. When you give them a theory, their first question is, where's the proof? The intuitive, by contrast, barely registers the surface. They perceive patterns, possibilities, hidden connections. They see not what is, but what could be, what the data implies, what the situation might become, what meaning lies beneath the obvious. They are often right about things they cannot explain, and they are often impatient with details that seem to miss the point. These 2 types can look at the same situation and see entirely different things, not because one is smarter, because they are using different instruments. The second pair are the judgment functions, the 2 ways a mind can evaluate and decide: thinking and feeling. This is where Jung gets most misunderstood, so pay attention. Thinking, as a function, makes decisions based on impersonal logic, objective analysis, consistency of principle. The thinking type asks, what is true? What is efficient? What does the evidence conclude, regardless of who is affected? This is not coldness. It is a cognitive preference for impersonal criteria. Feeling, as Jung defined it, is not emotion. It is a judgment function that evaluates based on personal values, relational impact, and what matters to the people involved. The feeling type asks, what is important here? What does this mean for the people affected? Is this aligned with what I value? This is not weakness. It is a different standard of evaluation, one that treats human significance as a legitimate basis for decision. The thinking type. Watching a feeling type make a decision often concludes they are being irrational. The feeling type watching a thinking type make a decision often concludes they are being cruel. Both are wrong. They are using different functions to navigate the same reality. Now here is what Jung added that makes the system genuinely dangerous to ignore. Everyone has all four functions, but they are not equal. One function becomes dominant, the most developed, the most trusted, the one you reach for automatically under pressure. A second function supports it. The third is less developed, less reliable. And the fourth, what Jung called the inferior function, is the most primitive, the most unconscious, the least under your control. Your dominant function is your greatest strength. It is also your greatest blind spot, because you assume everyone else is using it too. You assume your way of taking in reality or making decisions is simply the correct way, the obvious way, and that people who don't share it are confused or deficient. They're not confused. They're dominant in a different function, and they think exactly the same thing about you. This is the architecture of the 8 types. Each one is defined by which function is dominant, and whether that function is directed outward or inward. That combination determines not just how you think, but how you live, what you pursue, what exhausts you, and where you will reliably, predictably fail if you never look at it honestly. In the next part, we go through each one. 8 types, not 8 boxes, 8 structures, each with its own logic, its own way of moving through the world, its own characteristic excellence, and its own characteristic failure. Read these not as descriptions of other people. Read them as mirrors. The extroverted thinker organizes the external world through objective logic. This is the person who builds systems, creates hierarchies, demands efficiency, and has very little patience for sentimentality in professional contexts. They are often effective leaders, clear, direct, results-oriented. Their blind spot is the human cost of their decisions, which they consistently underestimate. They don't lack feeling. They lack access to it when it matters most. The introverted thinker builds internal frameworks to understand how things work, not to act, to understand. This type produces philosophers, theoretical scientists, systems architects. They detect inconsistencies others miss entirely. Their failure mode is paralysis. So much analysis that action becomes impossible. And when someone challenges their logic, they often experience it as a personal attack, which reveals just how identified they are with their own reasoning. The extroverted feeler creates and maintains social harmony. They read the emotional temperature of a room with precision most people can't access consciously. They are warm, adaptive, attuned. Their pathology is the slow erasure of their own needs in the service of everyone else's. Ask an extroverted feeler what they want, genuinely want, and watch the discomfort. They've been answering that question with what others need for so long, they've lost the thread back to themselves. The introverted feeler lives by a deeply private system of values. They don't broadcast their ethics. They embody them. This type has a ferocious authenticity and an equally ferocious intolerance for anything that violates what they hold sacred. They feel more than they express, which means they are consistently misread as cold or indifferent by people who mistake silence for absence. They are not absent. They are internal. The extroverted sensor lives fully in the present moment. immediate experience, physical sensation, aesthetic reality. This is where they are most alive. They respond to crises faster than anyone else because they don't pause to theorize. They act. Their failure is the long-term. Consequences that require abstract projection, planning that requires tolerating ambiguity, commitments that outlast the immediate charge of excitement. The introverted sensor trusts what has been tested. Memory, tradition, proven method, accumulated experience. These are the anchors. This type is meticulous, reliable, and deeply resistant to change that hasn't been justified by evidence. Their gift is continuity. Their cost is rigidity. The tendency to treat the past as a better guide than it sometimes is, and to experience novelty as threat rather than information. The extroverted intuitive sees possibilities everywhere and can't stop generating them. Ideas, connections, opportunities. They arrive in a torrent. This type starts projects brilliantly and finishes them rarely, because by the time execution is required, a new possibility has already appeared, and the energy has moved. They are often the most creatively generative people in a room, and the least reliable for follow-through. They don't lack discipline as a value. They lack it as a structural capacity. When the initial charge fades, the introverted intuitive perceives what others cannot articulate, patterns beneath the surface, implications that won't become visible to others for years. This type often knows things they cannot explain, hunches with an uncanny track record that still cannot be made fully rational. Their failure is disconnection, so absorbed in the interior landscape of symbols and visions that concrete reality becomes almost irritating. They can see 20 years ahead and miss what's directly in front of them. None of these types is a life sentence. Jung was explicit. The goal of psychological development is not to be your type perfectly. It is to become conscious of your type, to develop your non-dominant functions deliberately, and to stop mistaking your preferred lens for the only lens. Your type tells you where your energy flows naturally. What you do with that information is the question that actually matters. And to answer it honestly, you first need to face the part of your type you've been avoiding, the function that operates in the dark, running your life from a place you can't easily see. Every strength has a shadow. Jung knew this better than most, and he built it directly into the architecture of psychological types. Your dominant function, the one you trust, the one you've developed, the one that makes you competent and confident, does not exist in isolation. It exists in direct tension with its opposite. And that opposite, the function you've neglected most, the one that received the least development and the least conscious attention, is what Jung called the inferior function. It is not merely weak, it is primitive. It operates with the logic of a much younger mind. Impulsive, reactive, disproportionate. When it appears, it doesn't announce itself. It erupts. And because it is so undeveloped, so far from conscious control, it tends to appear precisely when you are under pressure, exhausted, or emotionally destabilized, which is to say, exactly when you can least afford it. The extroverted thinker, precise, logical, systemically brilliant, has introverted feeling as their inferior function. Under stress, this person doesn't become more logical. They collapse into melodrama, hypersensitivity, irrational grievance. The same person who dismantles faulty arguments with surgical precision will, when cornered, take a mild criticism as evidence that no one has ever respected them. The function that was never developed takes over with all the subtlety of a child throwing a tantrum. The introverted feeler, authentic, value-driven, intensely interior, has extroverted thinking as their inferior. Under pressure, they don't deepen their values. They become rigidly rule-bound, compulsively organizing external reality, issuing judgments with a harshness that shocks even themselves. The person whose greatest gift is nuanced inner attunement suddenly speaks in absolutes. Suddenly, everything needs a system, a hierarchy, a verdict. This inversion happens across all 8 types. The pattern is always the same. The function you trust least is the one that takes control when your defenses are down. And because it's unconscious, you rarely recognize it as your own. You experience it as something being done to you. The world suddenly seems unreasonable. Other people seem impossibly obtuse. You feel justified in your reaction in a way that, later, when the charge has passed, you can barely explain. Jung observed something even more uncomfortable about the inferior function. It is not just a liability. It is a portal. Because it is so undeveloped, so connected to the unconscious, it carries a charge that your dominant function no longer has. The things that destabilize you most reliably, the specific types of people who infuriate you, the specific situations that produce reactions far larger than they seem to warrant. These are not random. They are pointing directly at the function you've been refusing to develop. The person who enrages you most is often dominant in your inferior function. Their effortless competence in exactly the area where you are most primitive feels like an accusation. You don't experience it as envy. You experience it as contempt, as proof that they are missing something essential. But what you are actually experiencing is the discomfort of confronting your own undeveloped half. This is where most people stop. They identify their type, recognize their strengths, note their blind spots in the abstract, and proceed to live exactly as before, now with better vocabulary for why they behave the way they do. The inferior function becomes another item in the self-description rather than a site of genuine development. Jung called that a failure of individuation. The point was never to know your type. The point was to use that knowledge to become more whole, to bring the inferior function into conscious relationship with the rest of the psyche, not to perfect it, but to stop being secretly controlled by it. You don't conquer your inferior function, but you can stop letting it ambush you. And the first step is understanding that your most painful conflicts, the ones that feel most external, most caused by other people, are almost always the inferior function looking for a fight. Which brings us directly to what happens when two incompatible types share a life, a team, or a family. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a specific kind of conflict that feels different from ordinary disagreement. It doesn't resolve. It doesn't respond to good intentions or careful communication or mutual effort. Every attempt to bridge it produces a new version of the same impasse, and both people walk away more convinced than before that the other is either irrational, dishonest, or fundamentally broken. You've been in this conflict. You may be in it right now. Jung's diagnosis is precise. You are not failing to communicate. You are operating through incompatible psychological structures. And incompatible structures don't produce misunderstanding. They produce systematic, predictable, structurally guaranteed non-comprehension. Consider the collision between a dominant thinker and a dominant feeler. The thinker presents an argument. They have assembled the facts, followed the logic, arrived at a conclusion that seems to them self-evident. They are not being cold. They are doing what feels like the obvious, correct thing, letting the evidence speak. The feeler hears the argument and responds to what it means for the people involved. They raise concerns about impact, about relationships, about what gets lost in the logic. The thinker experiences this as evasion, as an inability to engage with facts. The feeler experiences the thinker's response as proof that they don't care about people. Both walk away feeling unseen. Both are right that they were unseen. What neither recognizes is that they were seen, through a lens so different from their own that the image didn't register as a person at all. The collision between an intuitive and a sensor is equally disorienting. The intuitive is already 3 steps ahead, speaking in patterns and possibilities, impatient with the specific. The sensor wants to know exactly what is being proposed, grounded in concrete evidence, implemented through clear and tested steps. To the intuitive, the sensor seems trapped in the literal, unable to see the larger picture. To the sensor, the intuitive seems untethered from reality, generating ideas with no accountability to how things actually work. Neither is wrong. They are perceiving through different instruments. But because each instrument feels like simply seeing clearly, the other appears to be the one distorting. These conflicts are most destructive in intimate relationships and close teams. The contexts where psychological proximity is unavoidable and the stakes are highest. A couple where one partner is an extroverted feeler and the other an introverted thinker will generate a specific recurring argument that follows the same structure every time, regardless of the surface topic. One needs emotional attunement and relational presence. The other needs intellectual respect and interior space. Each experiences the other's need as a demand to become someone they are not. And both are right. That is exactly what is being asked. Not consciously, not maliciously, but structurally. Jung was not optimistic that this kind of incompatibility disappears with understanding. What he believed was more modest and more honest. Understanding changes your relationship to the conflict. You stop experiencing the other person's structure as a moral failure. You stop waiting for them to finally see what seems obvious to you. You stop interpreting their limitations as evidence of bad faith. The conflict doesn't vanish, but it loses the specific cruelty that comes from believing the other person is choosing to be this way. That shift matters, because the alternative, the path most people take, is to spend years in a loop of judgment, resentment, and exhausted repetition, each cycle reinforcing the conviction that the other person is the problem. And the problem with that conviction is not that it's unkind, it's that it's useless. It produces nothing except more of the same. Understanding your type and the types of the people around you does not make conflict disappear, it makes it legible. And legible conflict can be navigated. Illegible conflict just accumulates. What you do with that navigation, how you use this map once you have it, is the hardest question of all. And it's the one we need to face directly now. Here is the temptation you need to resist. You've spent this video building a map of your psychological structure, your dominant function, your attitude, your blind spots, your inferior function, the patterns that run through your conflicts and your choices and your exhaustion. And the temptation, now that the map exists, is to use it as an explanation. To say, this is why I am the way I am. To treat the type as a destination rather than a starting point. Jung would have called that the most sophisticated form of self-dissection available to an intelligent person. Knowing your type is not self-knowledge. It is the beginning of the conditions under which self-knowledge becomes possible. The map is not the territory, and the person who memorizes the map while refusing to walk the actual terrain has learned nothing that matters. What the map actually shows you, if you're willing to look, is where you've been wasting energy. Every introverted thinker who has spent years performing extroversion to meet professional expectations. Every extroverted feeler who has built a life around everyone else's needs and called it generosity when it was really the avoidance of their own interiority. Every extroverted intuitive who keeps starting over, burning the current project for the excitement of the new one, and explaining it as following their passion. The map shows you the pattern. What you've been calling your life may be largely a strategy for staying within your dominant function and avoiding everything else. That avoidance has a cost. Jung observed it clinically. The functions you refuse to develop don't disappear. They go underground, they accumulate charge, they surface in your reactions, in the disproportionate anger, the irrational fear, the sudden collapse into behavior that seems to belong to a much younger, much less capable version of you. Your unlived psychological life doesn't wait patiently. It finds expression. usually at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible form. The hardest truth this video has been building toward is this: you cannot grow within your type. Growth requires moving toward what your type finds most threatening. The thinker developing feeling, not performing warmth, but genuinely sitting with values and relationships and their own emotional life without immediately converting everything into analysis. The feeler developing thinking, not becoming cold, but learning to evaluate situations through impersonal criteria without experiencing it as a betrayal of everything they care about. The sensor learning to tolerate the ambiguity that intuition requires. The intuitive learning to finish what they start, to honor the concrete, to live in the present long enough to see what's actually there. This is not comfortable. It will not feel natural. By definition, it cannot, because you are moving into the least developed part of your psyche. Jung did not promise it would feel good. He promised it was the only path toward what he called individuation, the process of becoming a whole person rather than a highly competent fragment of one. The challenge you're left with is not behavioral. It's not a list of things to do differently starting tomorrow. It's a question about what you're willing to confront in yourself. Because your type has been protecting you from something, from the discomfort of your inferior function, from the demands of your undeveloped side, from the specific kind of growth that your particular structure finds most threatening. And that protection has served you. It has also cost you more than you've been willing to calculate. You now have a language for the structure of your own mind. That language is only useful if you do something with it that is genuinely difficult. Not just knowing the map, but using it to go somewhere you haven't been. Most people will watch this, recognize themselves, and change nothing. That's not cynicism. It's the pattern Jung documented across decades of clinical work. Insight without action is the most comfortable form of stagnation available. You feel like you've moved. You haven't. If this video did what it was supposed to do, there's something uncomfortable sitting with you right now. Don't explain it away. Don't file it under things to think about later. Stay with it. That discomfort is the only part of this that's actually useful. There's more on this channel that continues where this left off. Not as a sequence you're supposed to follow, but because the questions this video opens don't close neatly. If you're genuinely interested in what Jung was pointing at, you'll find it worth staying.